So now it's time to dive into Next.js, or to dive into its core features. And we are going to start with routing in Next.js applications, because that is one of the main things it changes compared to regular React apps, and it changes it to the better, I would say. It makes it easier. We are going to move from code-based routing and route configurations to file-based routing. And in this course section, you are of course going to learn what exactly that means and how that works. Now, for that, we are going to understand what exactly file-based routing is and how it works. We are going to explore static and dynamic routes, because both can be handled by Next.js routing, and I will explain what the differences are. And we are going to navigate between different pages, so we're also going to see how that works. Now, to get started, I created a brand new project, a brand new Next.js project, and I created it just as shown in the last course section. I did attach this project here though, which I created because I pre-configured it a little bit. I cleaned it up a bit, to be precise. The pages folder is pretty empty here. The styles folder only has one styles file with some predefined styles I set up for you. And therefore, I do recommend that you do download this attached snapshot so that we're all starting with the same base. And once you did download it, make sure that, for example, through the integrated terminal here, you then run npm install to install all the dependencies that are required for this project. For this command to succeed, you need to make sure that npm and therefore Node.js is installed on your system from nodejs.org, for example. Now, once you did that, we're all ready to go. And now let's dive into file-based routing and understand how that works in Next.js applications. In traditional React apps, so in React apps where you are not using Next.js, you set up routing like this. You have some code in one of your React components where you do add various route-related components from React Router DOM, which is a great library. And there, of course, isn't necessarily anything wrong with this setup, but this is not how we'll do it with Next.js. There, we don't install React Router, and we won't write any JSX code or any JavaScript code at all when it comes to defining our routes and our page structure. Instead, with Next.js, we create React component files. So regular React component files in a special folder, as you will see, and we will then let Next.js infer our routes in our project from that folder structure we set up there. We use the special pages folder for that because Next.js will automatically look into that pages folder to infer our route structure. Now, how does this work? Well, let's consider this example pages folder. Here in this pages folder, we would have an index.js file, and then as a sibling to that file, we have the about.js file. And then we have the products folder as a sibling to the index and about.js files, so as a subfolder in pages. And in products, we have two additional JavaScript files. The index.js file again, but now in products instead of just pages. And then a file with a rather strange file name, square brackets, and then ID inside of those square brackets, .js. Now I'll come back to this strange looking file name in a second. Let's first of all have a look at what Next.js would do. It would look at this pages folder and now infer a couple of routes we want to support. For example, based on Next.js, it would infer that this should be our main starting page for requests to our domain / nothing. So for an empty path. For about.js, it would infer that we, for example, want to load an about page here. So it would in the end just render the component returned in the about.js file. And it would load that component for our domain.com / about. So it takes the file name as a path, as you can tell, with the exception of index.js. That's a special file name which it will assume as the root path for the given folder in which you are. So directly in the pages folder, index.js would be our root path, an empty slash after the domain. Inside of products, for example, index.js would be loaded for mydomain.com / products. So not /products / index, but just /products / nothing loads index, just as just mydomain / nothing loads index in the pages folder. If we have a file named differently, like about.js here, then this file name is used as a path segment. An alternative to naming a file about.js, therefore, would also be to create a subfolder named about with an index.js file inside of it. That would lead to the same result, because index.js files are treated in that special way I just explained. And of course, we're going to see all of that in action soon. Now, what about this strange square bracket file name here? This is a special notation we can use to add a dynamic path. So for example, if we have the product detail page here, so if we show some content for a selected product, then of course we want to show that same page for different products. So our URL would look something like this: our domain.com / products / and then the ID of a given product. And of course, we can have multiple products and therefore multiple IDs. And that's why this is dynamic. The ID isn't always the same. And as a developer, we can't predefine our different detail pages for the different products because A, we might not know in advance how many products we'll have, and B, even if we knew, it's always the same page. Just the data on the page will be different. And that's why Next.js supports such dynamic paths as well, with that special file name. So that is the equivalent to defining such a dynamic path with React Router like this. So now that we had a first glimpse at this file-based routing system in theory, let's apply it in practice to this demo project we set up here so that we really understand it. This pages folder is important, as you learned. And in this pages folder, we can add a new file. We can add a new file and we can, for example, name it index.js. You learned that index.js is a special file name such that Next.js will not use the file name as a path then, but instead will load the index.js component as the main component for /nothing. So here in this case, we have index.js, and this file would be loaded if we just visit our domain, and then we have no other path after our domain, so just our domain /nothing. But what goes into this index.js file? Well, as mentioned before, just a regular React component. There's nothing special to that. You don't need any special code in here. You just add a normal React component, you export this component, and then with that, Next.js will render that component when a request reaches this file through Next.js routing system. So therefore, in this file, we can add a component, and we can add a class-based component or a function-based component, and I will stick to function-based components only in this course. So therefore, we can add a new component, a new function here, and name this homepage, for example. Now, the name is totally up to you. This doesn't have to be named homepage. Any name is okay. I'm just using homepage as a name here because it will be the root page loaded, and whilst it is a regular component, technically we will treat it as a page. It will occupy the entire page, and that's why I add page in the component name. But you can name this component however you want. Now in this component, we then want to return our JSX code just as we know it. So here I will return, let's say, a div, and in that div, a simple h1 tag where I say the home page. Definitely not too inspiring yet, but we'll get there. Now we need to export this function as the file default. So either like this, or what I like to do, but it's up to you, like this. We need to export this function, this component, so that Next.js knows which component should be rendered as a page, because in theory you could of course define multiple components and have multiple functions in that file. Now with all of that, once you save that file, we can see it in action. For this, in your terminal here, simply run npm run dev to bring up the development server for this Next.js application. It will open up on localhost 3000 by default. And therefore, once you visit that in the browser, you should see this. And it's just a bit big here for me because I zoomed in quite a lot so that you can see this. So that's what you should see on the screen. And of course, that's the content returned by this component in our index.js file. And we do see this on the screen because we're visiting our domain /nothing. There's nothing after that slash. If I would enter about here, it would crash and we would get this default 404 page, which we get here during development because we didn't define a component for that yet. Well, that's what we're going to do next though. So now that we understood how we can generally add our page components, let's add a second page. For this, let's add a new page file, so a new file in the pages folder, and we can name this one about.js. And the file name does matter here, just as it did for index.js, because index.js was a special file name. About.js is not, but now, since it's a file name different than index.js, now that file name will later be used as a path. Now in here we can add a new function, name it about page, and then return another div here where we have a h1 tag and say the about page. And we're going to build some more exciting apps later in the course, but to get started, I want to keep that simple for now. And then we also export this. We export this about page here. Now if we save this about page, we can go back and visit localhost 3000 about. Of course, this npm run dev process still has to be up and running for that to work. And you see that this now works, and we get this about page, and we no longer get this 404 error because we added this about.js file. So that's how we can add multiple pages. There is a different way of doing that though. Now we can add more and more pages by adding more and more files here. But at some point you might want to structure your pages in a different way, or you need some deeply nested path consisting of multiple segments. In such cases, you can add folders to the pages folder. For example, here we could add the portfolio folder, and in that folder, inside of the portfolio folder, add an index.js file. So again, this special name, but now nested in the portfolio. Now in there, we can again create a function, the portfolio page function. And of course, that's just another React component which we're adding. And here we could add the portfolio page as the content, and then export this default portfolio page like this. If we do that and save everything, we can also visit /portfolio here, and we see the portfolio page. Therefore, this is an equivalent to creating a file named portfolio.js one level above that folder. So instead of about.js, we could have created an about folder, and in that about folder, we could have added an index.js file, and then we could also have our about page component in this index.js file in the about folder, instead of having the about.js file here. So now I deleted this about.js file, and if we save everything, we can still visit /about. So that is a perfect replacement. That is an alternative. And it's up to you what you prefer. If you want to have subfolders to structure that, or if you want to have files with that name. Now, subfolders don't just exist so that we have an alternative to a file named about, though. Instead, we need them if we want to create paths that consist of multiple segments. For example, in Portfolio, if we want to have, let's say, a list.js file, so that we can have a URL of /portfolio/list, then there is no way around having a subfolder. Because in there, we can now create our list page and return our JSX code here, the list page. And of course, just as before, then export this list page. But now with that, we can visit /portfolio/list, and we see that, but there wouldn't have been another way of getting this to work. Without that portfolio folder, we could not create this nested path. So that is a use case where we then definitely need nested folders. And of course, in general, having some kind of structure in the pages folder and working with subfolders for grouping files together isn't a bad idea in general, because of course that allows you to keep your files more organized, especially if you're working on websites with dozens or hundreds of pages. So now we also learn about those nested folders to construct nested, more complex paths, or as an alternative to having a file of the same name. But maybe you also remember that last use case down there with the square brackets. This can be used to have a dynamic path with a dynamic path segment. And that's another key feature Next.js offers to us. Let's say here in this very simple dummy application we are working on, in our portfolio folder, we don't just want to have the root path for /portfolio and the list path, but we also have different portfolio items, different portfolio projects, let's say. And those projects might have different IDs or slugs, and we want to load the different data in the same kind of component for those different slugs or IDs. That's exactly where we would create such a dynamic route component. And here, the naming pattern is always exactly the same. You use square brackets, and then of course still .js because it's still a JavaScript file. And inside of the square brackets, any identifier of your choice. So this is up to you. It doesn't have to be ID. It just very often will be some kind of ID. But that's up to you. It could, for example, be project ID, just to really emphasize that this can be any term you want. The square brackets matter though, because those tell Next.js that here we don't want to have /portfolio/project ID, but that instead this is a placeholder for any kind of value, which we then will have access to in the component to load different kinds of data. But that will be the next step. So therefore, let's now save this. And even though this might look strange, this is a perfectly valid file name. And now in here, we can create a new function, the portfolio project page function maybe, where we return another div where we say the portfolio project page. And then just as before, we simply export this page component. Now, how can we load this component or this page? Well, it's a placeholder, as I said, and it's in the portfolio folder. Hence, what we can do is we can enter portfolio slash, and then any value of your choice. For example, something. And you see the portfolio project page. Also, if we use /1 instead of /something or /hello. So whatever value we enter here, this is valid because here we defined that we want to accept any value, that we just have a placeholder here. And now we're filling in a concrete value for that placeholder. Please also notice though that /list still loads the list page, since Next.js is smart and checks your other files as well. So if it sees that a value could be treated as a value for this placeholder, it also checks if you maybe have a more concrete file for that exact value. So for /list after /portfolio, it sees that there is a list file in the portfolio folder and it prioritizes that file over this dynamic file. And that's a great behavior because it means that you can have static predefined route page files next to dynamic ones like this one. But what can we now do with that file? It's a placeholder, but what's the real benefit we get by using such a placeholder? As I said, a common scenario for using such a dynamic page would be that you have the same kind of page that should be loaded for different pieces of data, different products in a shop or different blog posts in a blog, or like in this case, different projects we want to show on our portfolio page, for example. So therefore now inside of this page component, we typically now want to use the concrete value that was entered, so the concrete project ID here, and then probably reach out to some database or something like this, fetch data from there, and then use that concrete data in this component to bring that data to the screen. So how do we then get access to the concrete value that was entered by the user in the URL? For this, Next.js gives us a special hook we can use. For this, we need to import something from next/router. So from the Next library and there from the router subpackage. And we need to import the useRouter hook. So that's a React hook defined by the Next.js team, which we can use in any functional component. Alternatively, if you're working with class-based components, there also is a withRouter higher order component which you can wrap around your class-based component to get a special router prop injected into your component. But we're using the more modern functional component only approach here, and therefore we will use this useRouter hook. Now inside of the functional component, we can then call useRouter like this, and this will return a router object to us. Again, if you would be using withRouter, you would be getting that router key here on your props object. Now what does this router object give us, which we're getting here? This router object exposes various pieces of data and various methods we can use. Now we'll have a look at the methods later when we dive into navigating between pages, but when it comes to the data properties, we for example get the path name. And let's see what's inside of that by simply console logging it here, so that we can see what we get there as a value. And let's also console log something else. Let's console log router.query. That's another interesting property we can access on that router object. With that, if we save this updated project ID page here, if we go to /portfolio/something or anything like that, and we then open up the developer tools, we see the path here. And the interesting thing here is that we don't see the path we entered in the URL /portfolio/something, but the path inferred by Next.js. So the path to the component file that had to be loaded to bring this to the screen, the portfolio folder, and then the square bracket project ID.js file, if you want to read it like this. And that, of course, is the path Next.js had to take to reach this component, which is responsible for what we see here. So that is the encoded, the inferred path Next.js took. Then here we have an empty object, but we can't ignore this double output we're getting here for the moment. Instead, if we have a look at the last log here, we see that it's actually not an empty object, but it is an object with a project ID property and then a value of something. And that's the interesting part now. This query property on the router gives us access to the concrete data that is encoded in the URL. So it gives us access to the concrete value we get for this dynamic path segment. So we entered portfolio/something, and therefore something is the concrete value for this project ID placeholder. And that's why on this query object, we get project ID as a key name, because I picked project ID here as a value between the square brackets. And then something, so what we entered in the URL, as a value. And that means that we can use this router query property to get access to the concrete value encoded in the URL. And if this would be the ID of some database object, we could then send a request to some backend server to fetch the piece of data with an ID of router.query.projectID in this case. That's how we could use this encoded value. And that, of course, is how we will use it later once we also dive into data fetching. Here, I just want you to understand how that routing works and how we can get access to the different pieces of data we might need. And that is how we can get access to this dynamic segment value. Now, when working with such dynamic routes, such dynamic paths, there are two interesting variations or extensions of that concept you should be aware of. One variation or extension is that you can, of course, also have nested dynamic paths. So let's say, besides portfolio/project ID, we also have another folder, the clients folder, let's say, and we want to construct a nested path here where we have a dynamic client ID, which can be different for the different clients. And then for every client ID, we have some static pages, like a list of all projects we did with that client, but then also dynamic nested paths for the individual projects we did with a client. Not clear what I mean? Let me show it to you. So for clients, I might want an index.js file where I list all my clients. So here we could have a function which I name clients page, and then I return a div here with a h1 tag of the clients page, and close the div, of course. And I export that. And of course, that's nothing new here at this point. But then I want to have a dynamic path, but a dynamic path with nested paths. So not a file named square bracket something.js, but instead we can have a subfolder which also has this square bracket name. So here we could then have the ID of a client. But now that's not a file, that's a folder with this special name. And then here again, we could have an index.js file. And that could, for example, list all the projects or all the client projects. So all the projects for a given selected client. And hence here I have a div where I say the projects of a given client. And we export this as well. And we could have more static files here, like an overview.js file or whatever. But we can now also have another dynamic folder or file nested inside of this already dynamic folder. For example, let's say for a selected client, we then have different projects. So here we have the client project ID identifier. And of course, as always, what you write between the square brackets is up to you. So this could then be a page for an individual project for a selected client. So the selected client project page, whatever. That could be a name here. And I'm just coming up with some examples here because, of course, these are use cases you could encounter in a real app you're building. So the project page for a specific project for a selected client. And we can also export that. Okay, so with that, I added a bunch of new folders and files, and the interesting thing, of course, is that we have this dynamic folder name. How could we now reach those different files and pages? Well, we can enter /clients to reach this index.js file, and there's nothing special about this. If I enter /clients, I see the clients page, which is the output of this functional component. But now we have this dynamic ID segment folder, and in there we have an index.js file as well, where we, for example, want to list all the projects of a given client. So therefore, we could enter clients/max, if that would be the identifier of a given client, and we see the projects of a given client, which is the output of this page here. And then we can also drill even deeper with yet another dynamic segment with clients max project 1, if that would then be the ID of a specific project for this specific client. And therefore we now see this output. And in all these pages, we can of course get access to the concrete values entered in the URL. So here in the selected client project page, we can again import use router from next router. And then in here, simply get access to the router by calling use router and then console logging router query. And if we do that, we see that we do get an object with two properties now, because I am logging this in a component that is loaded for a file name with a dynamic segment, which is inside of a folder with a dynamic segment. And you always get access to all the concrete values for the different placeholders that might have been part of the overall path for which this component was loaded. So therefore, we get access to the concrete ID value, since we're in that dynamic ID folder. And then since we're in this dynamic client project ID file, we also get access to that concrete value, so that we can use all these values in our project or in our component file here to then fetch the specific project for this specific client, for example. Now, if I would use router in the index.js file inside of the ID folder here, and therefore, of course, we also need to import use router here as well. So if we import use router from next/router, if I do that, then you will see that if I visit just /max, and therefore this index.js file, we of course only get access to the ID property here, because that is, well, just in the ID folder and not inside of this client project ID JavaScript file now. So that's how we can load pages dynamically for various dynamic parameters and how we can get access to these parameter values. And as mentioned before, in the upcoming sections about data fetching and so on, we are of course also going to leverage those dynamic values. Now, I did mention two extensions or variations of this concept here. And the nested dynamic segments, that was one important aspect of routing in Next.js when it comes to dynamic routes. The other important variation or extension is that you can also define collect all routes or catch all routes. What does this mean? Let's say we also have a blog subfolder, And now we might have different ways of loading blog posts. For example, we could get just the slug, just the ID of a blog post. So therefore, of course, in there, we could add a file named id.js. But maybe we also want to support other URLs for loading a single blog post. For example, we want to support /blog/the ID of a post, but maybe we also want to support /blog/2020/12/the ID of a post to only search for this post if it was released in December 2020. Or we just want to load blog/2020/12 to load all blog posts for that specific month in that year. So we have different URL formats which we want to support, and maybe we want to support them all with the same component. So no matter what the path is and how many segments it has, we always want to load the same component. And that's what we can do with such a catch-all route. Instead of just using square brackets and then any identifier of our choice, we can add a syntax here or a special notation here, which you might know from JavaScript. We can add 3 dots here, like the spread operator in JavaScript, and then again, any name of your choice. So that could be ID, that could be slug. I'll go for slug here. But again, that name is up to you. The 3 dots are not, though. This, of course, is no special file name from the operating system's perspective, but Next.js will treat it in a special way, just as it treats all files with square brackets in the file name in a special way. So how does it treat that file? Well, we still define a React component in there. So we could have the blog posts page here, for example, to load all the blog posts, but then we don't know if we get, for example, a path with the year and the month, or just with the year, or with a specific blog post already, or some other filter criteria, depending on what we want to support in our page. So here I'll return my good old div with the h1 tag of the blog posts, and then export this as a default. And I will already import useRouter here. useRouter from Next.router so that we can look into what the Next.router gives us here. So therefore, I'll get access to my router by calling useRouter and then console log the good old router query value again, like this. And if we now do that and save this, and we go to /blog/2020/12, for example, you see I do load the blog posts page. And here we get our query object with that slug property, because I chose slug as a name here after the 3 dots, but the 3 dots are not part of that property name, as you can tell. And then here we get an array now. And that's different. Before we always got a single value, a single string. Now it's an array of strings for the different segments that were caught. So here we caught the 2020 and the 12 segment, separated by slashes in the URL. But because we defined this as a catch-all path with the 3 dots here, Next.js does catch anything after blog. Because we're defining this in the blog folder, anything after blog is caught by this page component and is made available as an array through that slug property on that query object in the router object. And now we could be using these values to send a request to our database to filter for blog posts where the year is 2020 and the month is 12. And of course, you could encode whatever you want here, and you get those values. So that's how this works and how you can utilize that. And that's another important feature which sometimes can become important and which sometimes can be helpful, since it allows you to write very dynamic paths where not just the individual segment values are dynamic, but even the number of segments are dynamic. And that's not always what you need, but sometimes it is. And therefore, it is important to know that Next.js supports this syntax as well. So now we built a bunch of dummy components, a bunch of dummy page components here. Of course, our application, if you want to call it like that, isn't doing anything useful though. And it's not doing anything useful on purpose because I just want to show these core features first before we then later combine what we know to build something more realistic, to build a real application. Now, up to this point, we have all those different pages and components, but we can only navigate between them by manually changing the URL. And that's, of course, not very realistic. In reality, we typically want to navigate through links or programmatically when some action completed. And therefore, that's what we're going to have a look at right now. And for this, let's go to our main index.js file. So directly in the pages folder, this homepage component here. There, let's say we now also want to add a bunch of links. So we can add an unordered list component with a couple of list items. And then in every list item, we want to have a link to some of those pages we created here. For example, we could add links to the portfolio index and to our clients index. Now, how do we do that? Normally, we add links with an anchor tag. We can do this here as well. We could add a link like this and it would work. But this has a disadvantage. Now let's add it like this though. Let's add a link as an anchor tag. Hence, if we go back to just our domain /nothing, we see that link. If I click it, I'm taken to the portfolio page. It works, but it has a disadvantage. The disadvantage here is that with such a standard link, we in the end send a brand new HTTP request to load this new page, which means that any application state we might have on our running React app would be lost. If we have some app-wide state, which is stored with React context or Redux, it would be lost since we send a brand new request and we get a brand new HTML page. And that's not really the idea of building a React app, no matter if you're using Next.js or not. You want to stay in that app and you want to manage app-wide state. That shouldn't change just because you use Next.js. Because if that would not work this way anymore, it would actually be a disadvantage and not an improvement. So therefore, we typically don't want to use links like this. Instead, when using React Router in a non-Next application, we import a link component from React Router. And with Next.js, it's the same. For this, we again import something from Next, but now not from Next Router, but from Next link. And we import link. Important here, not between curly braces, because link is the default export of this link package from the Next library. So we import link, and link is a component which we can use. And we can use it as a replacement for the anchor tag. So we can simply replace a with link. Now link has a ref prop, which we can set, so we don't even need to change this. And the ref prop also takes a string with the path to which we want to navigate. Now if we save that, therefore, and we go back to our starting page, if I now click on portfolio, I still go to the portfolio page, but now without sending a HTTP request behind the scenes, without losing any app state we might have. And the link component actually also has a couple of other tricks up its sleeve. It has a couple of other improvements. For example, it automatically prefetches any data off the page we might navigate to as soon as we hover over the link and so on. So these are some advanced optimizations which will become important later. Now on this link component, we can also set a couple of other props. For example, we can set the replace prop to not push this new page, but replace the current page with it so that we can't go back. That can sometimes be useful. And we can also set a couple of other options, which we'll dive in later. For the moment, ref is the most important option. And therefore, of course, now we can add another list item with another link where we want to go to our clients. So here we could then set ref2/clients to be taken to that client's page. If we go back and reload this and go to clients, here we are. Now on that client's page, we might want to go to our individual clients. So we want to plug in a value for that dynamic ID. And therefore in index.js in the clients folder, here I also want to add a couple of links and I want to now navigate to dynamic routes. And that's what we're going to take a look at in the next lecture. So to navigate to dynamic pages, we can still use this link component which we import from Next link. We use it just as before. So here again, we can add an unordered list and add the link component and then say our first client is Maximilian. And here the ID of that client could be Max. So therefore we can simply set this to /clients/Max, for example. And then this simply is taken as a concrete value for this ID here in the squared brackets. And of course, we can have a second client here, let's say manual, where the ID then could be manu. And if we save that and have a look at our client's page, now we can click on Maximilian to be taken to the overview page with all the projects for this client for Max, as you can see here on the right. Or if I click on manual, I go to the same page, but with a value of manu for that ID. So that's how this works and how we can of course also navigate to pages with dynamic parameters. Now in reality, you often need to generate a list like this dynamically. So you might have some piece of data, let's say a clients array here, and every client is an object here with an ID of Max and a name of Maximilian, and then we have another client here with a name of manual and an ID of manu. So what I already have down there, but in reality you would of course often get such data from a database, for example, and you want to generate that dynamically. You can do this as well, just as you know it from standard React, because this is standard React. Inside of this component, it is a standard React component, nothing special about that. So therefore we can map our clients to list items just as we know it, set a key as we should to ensure that React is able to fully understand this list and update this list efficiently, and set this to client.id, for example, since that is a unique identifier. And then in the list item, we can use our link, and between the link tags, output client.name, and for the link, set a ref, which we also set to a dynamic value where we, for example, use backticks to create a template literal to set this path to /clients/ and then inject a dynamic value here, which is client ID. So with that, we render a bunch of list items with a bunch of links where inside of the link, as a text which is visible to the user, we output the client name. And as a value for the target, for the destination of that link, we create a string with a template literal by having the hard-coded /clients part and then the dynamically injected client ID, which is different for every client we're looping through. Hence, with that, if we save this and we go back to our client's page, it looks like before and it works like before, but now that list is generated dynamically. And that works just as you know it from standard React. So now we know how to use the link. Now for longer paths, constructing a link destination like this, so by building a string like this, can be cumbersome or annoying. That's why Next.js also gives you an alternative way, an alternative value you can provide for the ref prop on the link. Instead of providing a string, which is the path you want to go to, you can provide an object. So now this is not a special double curly brace syntax. This is still single curly braces to evaluate a JavaScript expression, and the expression here then just is a new object which I'm creating. And here, that's a special kind of object Next.js expects as an alternative to a string as a value for the ref. And here we can set various properties Next.js is expecting. For example, the path name property, which here would be /clients/ and then important ID in square brackets. So we describe the path as it would lead to our file in the pages folder. So here we want to go in the clients folder and then into the ID folder with square brackets around ID, and then to the index.js file. But as you learned, that is then the default file Next.js will be looking for. Hence the path name here is /clients/square brackets ID. And then we need to let Next.js know what the concrete value should be that should be plugged in for this ID here for this link which we're building. And we do this through the query property, which we can set in this ref object. And that then is an object, just as it is when we retrieve it with use router. There, query is also an object we can retrieve to have key value pairs, where the keys are our dynamic segment identifiers and the values are the concrete values entered. And it's the same here when we define a link. We then have a key, which is our dynamic segment identifier, so ID in this case, and then the concrete value for this concrete link which we're building here. So in this case, client.id. And that is then an alternative way of building that link. Now it's totally up to you if you prefer this over creating a string or not. This is totally up to you, but you can build it like this. And if you then save this and reload, you still have the client's page with those working links. And I'm just showing these alternatives so that you know all these different ways of using Next, and in this case, of using the link component. So now we learned about links, which allow us to navigate from A to B. Sometimes you need to navigate programmatically because a form was submitted, for example. And I want to show this as well. So let's say on the page for a specific client, we now also have a button. And when this button is pressed, we want to load project A for this client. Now we could absolutely use a link here if we just want to have a clickable thing that navigates somewhere else. I'm just using this here, this button here, to show how you could navigate imperatively. Typically, of course, you would not do that to replace a link, but to navigate in code when some action completed, when you parsed a form that was submitted, for example. But here, to learn how imperative navigation works, a button will do. So we have this button, and when the button is clicked, we want to navigate away. So therefore, first of all, we can define another function here in this component function, so a nested function, which should be triggered when the button is clicked. So the load project handler function, for example. Now we want to assign this function to this button here, and we do this through the onClick prop. Again, that is just standard React, nothing Next.js specific. Now in this function here, we might be doing all kinds of things, load data or anything like that. And once we're done, we want to navigate away. So when we do need to navigate in code, like we do here, then we can again use this router object, which we get from useRouter. And this object has a couple of properties, a couple of values we already saw before, but it also has a couple of methods that help us. For example, it has the push method to navigate to a different page. So using router push is like using the link component, just programmatically. And therefore here we can then go to /clients/max/project A, for example. If we now save this and I go to Maximilian page and I click on load project A, I'm taken to /client/max/project A. So that's how we can navigate programmatically. If we use router replace instead of push, then we replace the current page with that one, which means we can't go back after the navigation. And we can also not just pass in a string here, but again, just as before for the link, we can also pass in an object here where we then set a path name to /clients /square brackets ID /square bracket client project ID to encode these two dynamic segments into this path. And then set our query object to a nested object where we provide a concrete value for ID, in this case max, and a concrete value for client project ID, in this case, let's say project A. And that would simply be an alternative to creating or using a string. And if I do that, and I go back and reload, if I click load project A, that still works. So that's how we can navigate programmatically, which is also sometimes required, especially, as mentioned, for example, after submitting a form. Now, to conclude this module, there is one last special page I want to have a look at, and that's the 404 page. If I enter something /something here, then I get the 404 page and a 404 error because we're not supporting that value, we're not supporting that path. Now, of course, you might want to ship your own 404 page with your own content and style. And Next.js makes that easy. You just need to add a special file in your pages folder, so on the root level of your pages folder, next to this _app.js file and this index.js file. And here, in this folder, we now want to add a 404.js file. And it must be named like this because Next.js will then always load the component returned by this file or exported from this file when a 404 error arises. So here we can have our not found page. And in there, simply return a div where I say page not found. And of course, the content is up to you. And then here, I export this. And by doing that, by adding this page, this special file, if I now reload localhost 3000/something, I see my custom not found page. So that is how you can customize that. And that is it for this course section. We now had a detailed look at file-based routing and how we set up pages and how we navigate between pages with Next.js. We had a look at the pages directory and that the files and folders in there have a special meaning. Index.js is always treated as a root page for the given folder, so either the overall root page, if it's an index.js file in pages, or in portfolio or other subfolders, index.js would be loaded for /portfolio/nothing. We also can have other file names to, for example, load /portfolio/list and then load this list page component. And we can also have dynamic segments by enclosing placeholder identifiers in square brackets and then loading different kinds of data for different concrete values we might be getting. And we get access to the concrete value entered for a path segment through the use router hook, as you learned. Now we can also have nested dynamic segments, as we did with clients. And we can also have such catch-all files here by having square brackets and then 3 dots in front of any identifier of our choice. And that allows us to catch multiple dynamic segments in one go. And all these are very powerful features for loading pages in exactly the way you need. Now for navigating around, we want to use the link component provided by Next.js. Or if we need to navigate programmatically, we can do that through that router object, which we get through useRouter, or in class-based components through the withRouter higher order component. And therefore, we now know what file-based routing is and how that works. But is that now better than the code-based approach we know from standard React projects that do not use Next.js? Ultimately, that is of course up to you to decide, but I want to give you my perspective on that and a small comparison I came up with. When we compare file-based routing, which we get with Next.js, to this standard code-based routing we have in standard React apps with React Router, then in the case of file-based routing, we have no extra boilerplate code that needs to be written. So this kind of route configuration, which we need to write in our React components when using React Router, that is not required with Next.js and a file-based routing system. Instead of writing this boilerplate code, we simply create component files, which we would need to do anyways, and we just store them in a structure that replicates the path we want to have in our URL in the end. And that, in my opinion, is a very natural way of, well, setting up our page components and of storing our page components. So therefore, we do something we need to do anyways, and we save the other part of creating extra code just to tell React which component should be loaded for which path. We combine that into one step instead. Therefore, in my opinion, that's a very intuitive system of creating components and of storing components and of setting up routing. Therefore, we don't need to do anything for that. We get the routing for free, if you want to call it like that. So with file-based routing, the file and folder structure we have is everything. That influences our routes, and we therefore fully control the paths we support in our application through our folder structure in that pages folder. Now, for navigating around, we use a link component, and we can also navigate imperatively, so there's nothing special about that. Now, for code-based routing, we do have that extra boilerplate set up in code. Though, of course, you could argue that by doing that, you have some code where you can see which routes are supported. You don't need to look at the file system, though I would argue that looking at the file system wouldn't be too difficult. But of course, ultimately, that's of course up to you to judge. Now, it is definitely straightforward, don't get me wrong, but it includes new components and concepts which you need to learn, like that switch component and that route component, and how to order your routes, and so on. So that can be annoying. Now, a potential advantage, of course, is that the file and folder setup does not matter at all. In my opinion, having the folder structure dictate the paths is an advantage, but you could see this as a disadvantage as well. And with code-based routing, you can store your component files wherever you want. They won't have any influence on your routes or your paths. Now, navigation works pretty much as it does with Next.js. You have a link component, and you can also navigate imperatively there, so no differences there. Therefore, overall, in my opinion, file-based routing is more intuitive and is easier to set up, but it is of course up to you to judge. Either way, it is how Next.js thinks about pages and routes, and therefore when working with Next.js, you want to embrace that file-based approach.